We begin in Ukraine, where Russian missiles and drone strikes have hit several Ukrainian cities overnight, killing at least 12 civilians. You're looking at live pictures right there. A residential building was hit in Uman, 200 kilometers south of the capital, Kyiv. Authorities also reporting deaths in the eastern city of Dnipro, where they say that a woman and a young child were killed. DW correspondent Nick Connolly joins me from Kyiv. Tell us a little bit more about these latest attacks, Nick.
Well, Sarah, in Uman, it seems like those casualty figures are set to rise further still. They're still going through those ruins. We understand that more than 100 people lived in the part of that high-rise block that was hit. There are reports of dozens of people already rescued, but still many unaccounted for. In Dnipro, as you also mentioned, 2 casualties, that is 100 kilometers away, so these were pretty sporadic. Kyiv was also attacked, albeit better protected, and all those missiles were shot down. Some damage to the power supplies in parts of Kyiv because of debris falling down from rockets that had been neutralized by the Ukrainian defenses. This comes as a big shock. Basically, there haven't been massive kind of rocket attacks far away from the front lines for more than a month now, and I think people had got used to sleeping in their beds and not really looking at their phones, not really listening out for those warnings. And this is obviously a very brutal reminder that this is still very much a place where people are vulnerable, sleeping at night in their homes.
And we're watching those rescue workers right now, Nick, as they work through the rubble of one of those buildings. Do we know how well equipped Ukraine's air defense systems are right now?
Well, certainly they have become a lot stronger over this more than a year of war. We understand from the Ukrainian military that 21 of 23 Russian cruise missiles were shot down. I think those figures might still change, and there's also the question of Russian drones. But this is a vast country. It's more than 1,500 kilometers wide from east to west, and even with all the kind of air defenses in the world, you're never going to be able to protect all of the territory all the time. Kyiv certainly feels a lot safer and seems to be able to knock a lot more of those Russian targets out of the sky. We've had news today of a second unit of those US Patriot systems now operational on the ground here in Ukraine. But it's also important to stress that the munitions for these systems are incredibly expensive and very slow to be produced. So even if those systems exist, the Ukrainians are really having to make a choice every time. Do we use what precious supplies we have to try and neutralize these rockets, or do we just have to let them fly past us because we might need those munitions in the future?
Nick Connolly in Kyiv, thank you. And Ukraine and the Western world have been waiting for months for Ukraine to begin a counteroffensive against entrenched Russian forces in the eastern part of the country. But the challenges for Ukrainian troops are immense as they take on a much bigger military force. Our next report looks at what it will take to win back territory and why it's taken so long to prepare.
Training near the front. These Ukrainian soldiers are getting ready for the big battle to come. It has gone more or less okay, but with some difficulties. We will work on this and get rid of the problems. We found the mines. We will rehearse again, and then it will be fine. Getting Ukraine's forces ready has been no small undertaking. Many of the country's most experienced soldiers have died or been wounded in over a year of grinding combat with Russian forces. That means the counteroffensive will also rely on fresh recruits who haven't seen battle. And there's another big problem. At the moment, there is a significant ammunition shortage. We lack high-explosive incendiary shells, so tanks and artillery are unable to work effectively. High-explosive shells have a much more destructive power, and the damage radius is much bigger than armor-piercing shells. Filling the ammunition gap will be key and will take time. But ammunition is just one part of a much bigger and more complex machine. The Ukrainians must coordinate tanks, infantry, artillery, air power, and engineers, relying on communications and quick decision-making. But they're up against considerable obstacles. If, as expected, Ukraine pushes to the south to cut Russian-held territory in half, they have to cross the Dnipro River. They'll face minefields and concrete obstacles known as Devil's Teeth. And that's before they reach Russian trenches, shown here in satellite pictures, while the Russians will likely be shooting at the Ukrainians the whole time. That kind of push requires equipment and may explain the longer-than-expected build-up to the counteroffensive.
They've really been arming their military from the ground up. So originally it was anti-tank guided missiles, then it was artillery, then it was infantry fighting vehicles, then it was tanks. Your listeners will remember, your viewers, sorry, will remember all the tanks that got pledged at the beginning of the year. And so at each stage, Ukraine receives what it wants. And look, I would do exactly the same thing if I was in their position, and then it asks for the next level of support.
The problem for Ukraine is that Western support is not likely to last forever. The spring counteroffensive, which may end up happening in the summer, has to show concrete gains to keep Ukraine's backers happy and to keep the weapons coming.
And earlier I spoke with Marina Myron of the Defense Studies Department at King's College London and asked her what the key challenges would be for Ukrainian soldiers during the coming offensive.
There are quite a few challenges, and one of the challenges is obviously the weather, so it's very difficult to time the counteroffensive. Aside from that, we have also heard that the Ukrainian brigades that are supposed to be used for this counteroffensive are not ready, so 3 of the brigades will be ready sometime in May, which gives the Russians enough time to prepare and also gives out important information on the potential counteroffensive. And, you know, apart from the fact that all the equipment has allegedly arrived in Ukraine, the Ukrainian armed forces still have to solve the logistical problems, because depending on where they want to conduct the counteroffensive, and it better be a surprise for the Russians, who are prepared. They've been preparing defenses since November. So since the time General Surovikin took charge of the so-called special military operation, the Russians have prepared echelon defenses, as we have heard in the report, and this will be very difficult for the Ukrainian to break through. So the idea is to stop them in their tracks. Then we have the issue of conducting combined arms operations, which are very difficult in terms of maneuver, in terms of logistics. You have to have good leadership. And the question is, despite all the Western equipment that has arrived, and even if the Ukrainians can solve the logistical problems without the Russians actually targeting Western equipment, so the equipment actually arrives on the front lines where the counteroffensive is supposed to take place, can the Ukrainians muster this very, very complex operation, given all the pressure that is currently coming from the political leadership of Ukraine, as well as kind of international audience who are waiting for the Ukrainian armed forces to deliver. So they have new equipment, they have fresh recruits being used, and they have to a very complex operation, and they know that the Russians are ready for that.
Can they master it, you think? I mean, because the Ukrainians, for their part, they say that they have trained these 9 brigades for a counter-offensive. And what are we talking about here concretely? I mean, is this now a tactical shift in the way that this war has been fought?
Well, that's a great question. I guess everybody wants to know if they can master it, and it will depend not only on skill, it will depend on many factors. It will depend on where this counteroffensive takes place, what the Russians do about it, because the Russians, we have seen, have started using more aviation. So for the Ukrainians, it will be difficult to coordinate the tanks and mechanized infantry and close air support. And, you know, the brigades have been prepared, that is true, but have they operated together in the theater using this new equipment, as I have just stated? So it will definitely be a challenge. And besides, we don't know, because the media is covering possible points of attack. And of course, the Russians are listening. So for Ukraine, what will be important is to make sure to trick the Russians into thinking they are attacking somewhere else in order to exploit this long front line, and use possibly battle reconnaissance in order to see where the defenses are at their weakest and strike there.
Marina Myron, thank you so much for joining us to share that expertise. Joining us from King's College in London, we appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Pope Francis has arrived in Hungary. It is the pontiff's first trip to the country, which shares a border with Ukraine. Francis plans a 3-day visit to be focused in great part on the war in Ukraine. He will be meeting with some of the million-plus Ukrainian refugees believed to have crossed into Hungary since the beginning of the war. You're looking at pictures there from the airport where the Pope has just touched down. You see him inside of a vehicle right now as he begins this trip, where he will also meet with Prime Minister Viktor Orban. The two have been at odds over Hungary's anti-migration policies. Again, the Pope just arriving there in Hungary. You're looking at live pictures from the airport where the Pope has just touched down. We see that he has entered a vehicle and is beginning his official visit to Hungary, which will last over the next few days.